was right out in the rain at a soccer game, so it must be fall, right? Which rain? Yes, that's true. All right, so
winter.
Dr. Margaret Brand, who was scheduled to be here, is still in the nursing home, recovering from her fall. So I'm sorry about that. Dr. McFarland asked to be a replacement. He does not claim to be a replacement for Dr. Brand, but at least he'll be speaking today. So we'll have something to listen to today. That's great. I have posted on the Blackboard site the reading for next week. We're having our second reading next week. It's our next installment of Academic Scandals. It's actually from the book titled Academic Scandals. And maybe the most scandalous thing is that each of the articles is now posted on Wikipedia. So they actually decided to post all the articles directly on Wikipedia and not bother with the cost of publication. So I actually purchased the book and you have a copy of the article from the book, Academic Scandals. But if you prefer to download it directly from Wikipedia, the reference is there. And can. And there's a discussion. The authors, the subject of the article, Dr. Suk from South Korea, contests some of the findings in the article. And so it's under contest. You can actually, that itself is an interesting piece in the Wikipedia site to read the contesting back and forth. And it's not any of the basic facts, it's just minutia that they're contesting. Anyway, that's next week. So next week you need to bring your summary of today's talk and your sort of outline of the second reading. Questions on that? Then you're on.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I am not Margaret Brand. I have never been to India. I have not been married to Paul Brand. I have lived in Seattle. She lives in Seattle. But I actually have recently written a book chapter that has something to do with Paul Brand. So when Margaret could not be here, I decided to dust off this old talk, update it just a little bit. And so hopefully I'll remember what in the world I was thinking with some of these slides. Definitely let me know if you have questions as we go along, because this is a little bit of an old topic for me. So hopefully I'll be able to present it, all the connections and all that. Let me know if I leave something out. So, but the connection, you notice up here, you don't see Paul Brand up here. Paul Brand is, here's a picture of him late in life. He died in 2003, so about 9 years ago, at the age of 88, I believe it was. He and his wife were medical missionaries to India. He was actually born to missionaries in India, and then he went back there. Actually, it may have been in Africa. He was one of those people that's all over the place, so I shouldn't try to summarize his page without actually having the facts, because whatever I remember, his life is probably much more interesting than what I even remember. So, but they definitely were medical missionaries in India for a long time. Paul made some significant scientific contributions. He was part of the group that figured out, or part of the group of people across the globe that figured out leprosy was not directly attacking the flesh. I mean, when you see a leper, the thing that you notice is that their flesh is disintegrating. And so if you think that if there's an infectious agent causing leprosy, that it's directly causing that. Leprosy actually is more indirect than that. It attacks the nerves. And because the nerves don't feel anymore, then the flesh is not attacked by the bacterium, but it's just destroyed by neglect. You know, like the whole thing about a leper will put their hand on a hot stove and not know about it. They'll stub their toe until their toe falls off. But because they don't feel it, they don't have pain. And so this actually, Paul Brand brought out some theological sides to this. Do we have pain for a reason in some cases? There's a whole book called The Problem of Pain that he wrote. He also worked on reconstructing the hands of lepers, tendon surgery. And he was one of the world's foremost surgeons on actually getting in and rebuilding someone's hands and feet, I believe. So he made important contributions to the basic science and also to the applied science of reconstructing hands. The Lasker Prize is basically one step below the Nobel. if you win the Lasker Prize, you're considered on the short list for the Nobel Prize. He never won a Nobel, but he won a Lasker Prize. And he got, I believe I got this abbreviation right, it's the commander of the British Order. It is a knighthood. So I'm not sure if you could call him Sir Brand, but you can. So, on top of that, Margaret was the one who was able to visit our class before, and she sat right up here. She talked in a really soft voice, but what I loved about it is that it didn't matter, because all the students were always so quiet for her. They had to be to hear her, but they had to also be to hear the stories, the great stories that she told, like about the time the tiger ran away with their kid and things like that. That's an actual story. Again, I'll let her tell you about it. This more captures about how she talks. I thought that this picture was a nice, happy picture, but when she's up here, you can imagine her. She just talks like that. She was a doctor, and she got her MD in either during war or post-war World War II England. And so there weren't that many women. She was a pioneer for women as well. She was an eye surgeon, and she worked with eye infections in India with Paul Brand. She's also a mother of 4. And the tiger did not completely carry away the baby, so that didn't become mother of 3 at that point. They moved to Seattle in the 2000s after some time in Louisiana, working on reconstructive tendon surgery and things like that. And then they moved to Seattle, sort of retired to Seattle, attended West Side Presbyterian up on the top of the hill on California Avenue over there. And so Paul Brand is, you may have even read, I'm not sure if you've heard of this book, Fearfully and Wonderfully Made. It's written with Philip Yancey. You may have read something else by him. And what this is it's Paul Brand looks at the human body as a physician, and really what he does, he never says this, but really what he's doing is natural theology. What he's doing is saying, what can we tell about God from looking at the body scientifically? It's kind of a weird question, and there's all sorts of wrong ways to do natural theology, but I'm convinced that Paul Brand does it right. His life story, 10 Fingers for God, that talks about basically his whole life, and you see Philip Yancey shows up here. Philip Yancey also shows up in this book, which is the one that just came out. I've known David Marshall. David Marshall actually goes to West Side Presbyterian, so he knew the Brands from his church. And he lives in the Seattle area, and he recently put together this book, Faith Seeking Understanding, Essays in Memory of Paul Brand and Ralph D. Winter, who is another medical missionary type similar to Paul Brand. And he asked if I would like to contribute a biochemist's view of things. So I said yes, and then I gave him an essay that was about J.R.R. Tolkien. And it had to do with Paul Brand as well, but I'm sure he wasn't expecting that. But he said okay, and he went ahead and took the essay, and so I published a version of what I'm going to talk about in this book with connections to Paul Brand. So why in the world did I write an essay about J.R.R. Tolkien for a book about Paul Brand? And well, one of the reasons is I looked at them and they seem to be similar. You probably know a little bit about J.R.R. Tolkien. I've just told you a little bit about Paul Brand. So from that information, what would you say that J.R.R. Tolkien and Paul Brand have in common? Old white guys, okay? Step 1. But what else do they have in common? Educated in England. In fact, there's some other English connections as well. Remember the CBO? Tolkien got his, I think, 10 years after Brand got his. So they were both knighted, although I think because Tolkien was born in South Africa or something, he couldn't be called Sir Tolkien, but I'm not sure. Anyways, all those British things. It's a big British award. Tolkien never won the Lasker, I can say that with confidence. What else do you know that they might share in common? Any ideas? You know something about Paul Brand's faith. What do you know about Tolkien's faith? Anybody know what kind of faith Tolkien claimed? You don't really think of him as a Christian writer, right? Anybody know what Tolkien believed about God? Where he went to church? Yeah. And he went to church all the time. He was a very committed Catholic writer. So I consider Tolkien to be a Christian writer, even though you probably shouldn't go into the Christian bookstore and ask for Tolkien. They probably don't have him unless their definition has expanded. But I think that faith permeates all of Tolkien's work in the same way that it permeates Paul Brand's work. Another thing that they both liked, Paul Brand talked about going over to the Olympic Peninsula and seeing a nurse log out in the, the Forks area, the Twilight area, and all that. But do you know what a nurse log is? You know, for if anybody doesn't, it's one of those logs that other logs is growing out of. It's fallen down, and other logs and other trees and other organisms are living off of its old husk, in a sense. And he talked about how that's kind of like the church carrying on. He loved to walk among trees. And how do you know that Tolkien felt about trees? I mean, yeah, he liked them so much. He thought that Shakespeare did trees a disservice because in Macbeth, remember it had that prophecy about the Birnam wood shall come, and that's one of the ways that Macbeth will be overthrown. I think that's how it works. But really what Shakespeare did is he had an army carrying branches. And Tolkien's like, no, that's not right. If we're going to have Birnam wood come and fight, we're going to really have trees come and fight. And so he did the Ents and Treebeard and all that. He loved trees, and it's very clear that his affection for trees was very deep. So, and both loved trees. And one of the reasons that Tolkien loved trees, these are some of the trees that Tolkien loved. So, anybody recognize this? Anybody been here? I'll give you a hint. It's near where Tolkien worked, so it's in Oxford. This place has a specific name. It's a specific walk. Anybody heard of Addison's Walk? It's right outside of Magdalen College, which is where C.S. Lewis spent most of his academic career. And you get the chance to, this is a picture I took when I was on it, you get a chance, it's a loop, and you just sort of can walk and walk and walk. And C.S. Lewis would used to walk there. In fact, there was one particular night when C.S. Lewis walked there with his friend J.R.R. Tolkien. So here's the river, and by the way, when I was reading like Narnia and stuff like that, I was always like, what's a punt? I thought a punt was when you kick something. Punts are boats that go on flat water like this. So when C.S. Lewis was talking about punts, he was thinking of boats with a pole that you would push up and down this water here. But this is Magdalen College. There's a gate right here. See the blue gate? And this leads out to Addison's Walk. I was standing on Addison's Walk when I took this picture. That building was not C.S. Lewis's building. This one was. I can't remember which window. One of these windows was C.S. Lewis's window. It overlooked a deer park that is actually part of the college. And we don't have a deer park as part of SPU, but apparently in Oxford they can have deer parks. And that's what C.S. Lewis would look at every day. And then when he got tired of thinking about old manuscripts, he would walk out and he would walk around Addison's Walk. Anybody been here? The Eagle and Child. And by the way, if I tell you that Tolkien went here a lot, does that ring a bell for you? Eagle and Child? The end, or actually scenes in both The Hobbit and at the end of Lord of the Rings look sort of like that sign. This is where J.R.R. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, and the other Inklings would meet. And they would read their stuff that they were working on. C.S. Lewis, Narnia, J.R.R. Tolkien, the Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit. And then this is just a cool tree that I saw as I was walking around, and I'm sure that J.R.R. Tolkien once looked at that tree and said, that's a cool tree, so there you go. That's a cool tree. But Addison's Walk is particularly important on September 19th, 1931, because that was a night that C.S. Lewis said was very important in his own life. C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Hugo Dyson were walking along it, And basically, if you've heard about the story about how Lewis finally made the leap to faith, he would say that the most important intellectual leap he made was probably during/after a conversation that he had with these other two walking around and around Addison's Walk late this night on 9/19. Tolkien even was affected by it. It was where Tolkien, who was already a committed Christian, explained the basic idea of Christianity, the basic idea of God writing the story of the world by the incarnation of himself into it. And so Tolkien wrote a poem about that night. I mean, how many times do you write a poem about a conversation you have with your friends? But that's apparently what Tolkien did. And he wrote it to Lewis, entitled it Mythopoeia, mythic work, I suppose. And the first line is, you look at trees and label them just so. And he goes on from that with the whole idea of labeling, naming stories and the natural world and God stepping into it. And so it's very appropriate. They had just been walking around looking at trees and talking about them, and their conversation probably started with that. The main message of this is that the myths are true. At this point, C.S. Lewis thought the myths were not true. Beautiful lies breathe through silver is the way that he put it, and Tolkien picks up on that phrase. But Tolkien's saying, no, what if they're true? What if they are the true thing? And this is where the turning point for Lewis came, where he really took a leap into becoming self-identifying as a Christian and not a theist. So Tolkien's trees, I mean, how do we know Tolkien liked trees? Well, the Ents, he was one-upping Shakespeare when we had a Treebeard. And by the way, Treebeard talked with, you know who talked with a hum, like Treebeard would talk, and kind of slowly and deliberately? A certain Jack Lewis. That's what his friends would call him. But C.S. Lewis was almost definitely the model for Treebeard. But if you look a little bit slowly, you'll find other trees that Tolkien liked. Tolkien liked linguistic trees. Now this is the part, if you're reading Lord of the Rings, you probably just skip over. But Tolkien would say, don't do that. I think it's the most important part. It's where the stories came from. He invented a language first, and then he made a story to explain the language. And so this is, in fact, he didn't invent just a language, he invented several languages. There's different kinds of Elvish. There's Dwarvish. And then, of course, he sort of fit English into there as human. It's kind of weird. But he had a whole tree of languages branching off. And Elvish languages in particular split, branched off, evolved from one to the other. And then, of course, there's the family trees. If you've ever read the Silmarillion, one of the things that people find so incomprehensible about it is that Tolkien assumes that you are like the ancient readers of Beowulf, and that you are A, interested in, and B, able to remember all these complex family trees. And the Silmarillion doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, A, there's no hobbits. B, it doesn't make a lot of sense because he assumes that you remember all this stuff. And so the Silmarillion actually is rewarding reading, but it's hard work. Hard work. And it's not like The Lord of the Rings, definitely not like The Hobbit. But it's trees, and those are behind that as well. So when I look at that as a biologist, of course, I think of gene trees. Darwin first had the idea of a tree of life that connected organisms that sort of was a picture of his view of evolution. And it turns out that this picture, once they discovered genes and related them, they discovered that genes related in such a way that we can draw these trees out of genes. And we can use them to show how the genes are related, and therefore how the organisms are related. So this idea that species are related and branch out from an ancestral root. And if you actually look at the other two kinds of trees, the last two kinds of trees on the last slide, those actually share a similar characteristic. So I thought this was interesting. And I'm not saying that Tolkien's an evolutionist or anything, but I think that Tolkien's scholarship led him to see trees behind life, just like when I look at genes as a biologist, I see trees behind those. Because DNA is only made up of 4 units, we can assign each unit a letter. And those letters can spell words. Not English words, for sure, but they can spell out words that make proteins, which are also, in a sense, words, but that's another story. So the DNA words, there are 23,000 DNA words in the human genome. And what's interesting is average in this room, I'm sure everyone here is like woebegone above average, but we probably know about 25,000 words. You probably know about as many words as there are genes in your genome. The thing is, when you look at two species that are similar, they also have similar genes. If they look similar on the outside, they look similar on the inside as well. And it's really neat how you can see the correlations. You can draw a tree based on their outside characteristics, tree based on their inside characteristics, their DNA words, and they'll look the same. So a family tree of species looks like Tolkien's family trees or his language trees. So you can draw a lot of similarities between those. Now, Tolkien died in about 1970s, so he didn't really get to see these kind of trees really take root in biology. And I just feel like that's a missed opportunity. I would love to know what he'd actually say about it. I'm sure he'd be a little grumpy. He was a little grumpy about everything. But still, this is the idea of gene trees. And notice how these are letters. There's only 4 letters up here. Well, this is the protein translation down here, but these are the DNA words. And there's 6 different DNA words. They wrap around like a hymn book, by the way, verse 1, verse 2, verse 3. But this is all one big DNA word times 6. One from human, one from chimp, one from gorilla, orangutan, bat, and mouse. The differences are highlighted. And so if you look at this, the way they're arranged, you see that as you go down, you tend to get more differences. Here you have 3 differences. Here you have only 2. Here you have 1. And so you can draw a tree of these as if they branched out from a single ancestral form of this word, of this gene word. And you can say, well, it looks like there was a branch and the mouse gene took off like one of Tolkien's language words. The bat gene was next, the orangutan gene, the gorilla gene, and the chimp and the human gene are most similar. They're 98.2% similar. And here's the actual genes right there. So this is where that comes from. So the idea is that there was a gene probably sharing about 98% of its letters. You can try to figure out what this blue gene was, the one that was common to both human and chimp before it diverged. And if you can do that, you might also be able to go back here. It's a little bit harder, but you also have more data. And you can go back and say, what could that red gene have looked like before there were mice, you know? So, and you can look through here and you say, oh, probably it has CAC in this position. And you can do some probabilistic calculations to say probably which one, probably which one is out there. So the thing is, that's a tree. So what's the point of that? Is it just an assertion? Well, actually, the tree can help us figure out some things scientifically. In 2010, there was an earthquake in Haiti on January 12th. And the thing about earthquakes is they don't just cause damage then. They also cause damage later because infrastructure is broken down. Things like water cisterns are broken, and sewage systems and water systems are not kept apart like they should be. And so you can have things like cholera feeding through both of those. And so people knew there was going to be probably some kind of cholera outbreak. They just didn't know when it would come. It did come on October 21st. And the question is, where did it come from? Hopefully, if we can find out where it came from, maybe we can try to stop it next time. So to pinpoint where it came from, this is the prevalence of cholera. So you can see, here's where it's red, the reddest had the highest prevalence, the next highest. So probably the cholera came from somewhere around here, probably didn't come from out here. But how can we be more specific than that? And the thing is, we can construct a gene tree from the cholera DNA to reconstruct the ancestor of all of these and try to pinpoint where that ancestor came from. And what they found out was kind of tragic. First of all, I just want to point out that there was an SPU student in the midst of all this. He was actually in the Dominican Republic when the earthquake hit. But of course, they needed a lot of help, and so he immediately crossed the border. Luke Davies ended up running a hospital in a certain way. Can you imagine that? 6 months out of SPU and you're running a hospital. That's essentially what he was doing. This was written before he knew what was going to happen. And so Luke followed life, followed his vocation, followed his calling, and ended up helping the people in need there. And he's actually returned a couple of times to do more of that. A little bit of biochemistry about cholera. Cholera is a protein disease. It's actually a microorganism, so it's like a microbe that's causing it, not a virus. And the microbe produces a big protein. And this is what's actually important to know about cholera, that this is the toxin. It's big. There's a lot of atoms. It's not little. Okay, this thing is huge relative to like a little toxin or a toxic cyanide or something like that. Cyanide is 2 atoms. This is thousands. And it's also a lunar lander structure. It comes down on the cell like this, and it binds to the outside of the cell, and it sticks to sugars that are sitting on the outside of the target cell. And then this part actually takes off and burrows down into the cell. And this is what causes the toxic effect of cholera. The key to this is that we know for sure it's big. Okay? Now this is the other stuff, and this is not, this is stuff that you'll see in biochemistry second quarter if you go take that class. What really matters is that there's a complex signaling network that's normally functioning in your cell. Once the cholera toxin gets in here, cholera binds to it, and it doesn't stop it. It sabotages it by keeping it going. It actually turns this so it's permanently activated. This is supposed to be activated like when adrenaline comes in. Adrenaline is supposed to be a rush. It's supposed to turn off. Cholera prevents it from turning off. And because cholera comes in drinking water, it prevents it from turning off in your intestine. The side effect of keeping this on is that the water balance goes completely haywire. Anybody know what the symptom of cholera is? Diarrhea, right? Yeah, an excess of water from the gut. And actually it's that dehydration that causes the death from cholera. So this is what we know. Cholera is spread by drinking water. If cholera is spread by drinking water, what if someone has cholera? What if someone in the middle of the room right here has cholera, and I shake their hands? Or even give them a big hug. Am I probably going to catch cholera from that kind of contact? Pretty much we have to at least share water. Actually, you have to be drinking. Basically, you have to be drinking some kind of sewage and water because it's what comes out the other end and goes in this end. So it's when the sewage and drinking water commingle that cholera is spread. It's because the protein is big. It can't fly through the air. The protein's too big to fly. And so that means that if you're careful what you drink, you're basically safe from cholera. And you don't have to worry about going around to treat people with cholera. So cholera wouldn't really be able to spread through a sneeze, or it'd have to be a really juicy sneeze, okay? Sorry. Biochemistry is all about gross stuff. Luke knew that. He also knew that rehydration was the key to treating cholera. It's not fancy. You give them Gatorade. It's helpful for some other things as well, but you give them clean water to replace the bad water that they've gotten, and eventually their system turns off, and eventually it comes back to equilibrium. So it's not like there's a fancy drug that's necessary to treat cholera. As a result, by knowing the biochemistry, Luke had confidence to not worry about coming close to the people who had cholera to treat it, because he knew how to, A, avoid getting it, and B, how to stop it just in case something happened. Now, remember that because it's a microbe, it has proteins and it has DNA to make the proteins. And so we can read those DNA words and we can try to do a tree from it. If you find the original set of words, you found the source of the epidemic, and that's exactly what they did. They made a tree of relationships. This is a tree of relationships right here. Between Haiti, it's really small, but this says Haiti, and these are different Nepalese strains. And what you see in that tree, the Haiti strain is right in the middle of all those Nepalese strains. It is a branch of the same tree. They found by looking at the DNA and sequencing it and comparing it to Nepalese. So this is where they come from, Nepal. How in the world did cholera from Nepal get in Haiti? And the tragedy of it is that it came from UN peacekeepers. Nepalese UN peacekeepers shipped in to help, intending to help, fully intending to help, but carrying cholera with them Cholera is the kind of thing that can persist in an otherwise healthy-seeming person, can be carried, and that got into the system that caused the epidemic. If it didn't come from Nepal, it probably would have come from somewhere else. But now we have the political ramifications that the people who are coming there to help actually ended up being the source of the cholera. I'm not entirely sure that this is a good thing to know. Like I said, cholera is very common, and we knew that some epidemic was coming. It's not like if we said no Nepalese peacekeepers, that then we probably wouldn't have a cholera epidemic. We probably still would have had it. So does it do too much good to rail against them for trying to come and help? I'm not sure. But that's a political question. There's the Haiti part. That's a political question, and I'll just have to stick with the science for this talk. So if we can do that with cholera, we can do that with other proteins as well. And really what you get is you find fairly consistent results for all sorts of species, bacteria to mammals, and you can draw a huge tree of life depending on which species you look at, where the species are all branching off from each other according to their DNA words. So the real question is, I resisted the Darwinian tree of life for a really long time. I didn't think it was compatible with reading my Bible. And now that I see that, now I think it is. And one of the people that I've found that's helped me along that road is actually J.R.R. Tolkien, because he used trees, different kinds of trees, but he used similar trees, and he used them in a way that let me see that I believe that this question is a wrong question. The idea that the Darwinian tree of life somehow pushes out the biblical tree of life. So here's Tolkien, and this is how Tolkien really had to do with trees. He was a philologist. And that's a study, we don't have a department of philology, although we do have people on campus with an interest in philology. It's a study of language. Today it's called linguistics a lot. But philology is technically in written historical sources. So it combines linguistics with history and literary studies. So Tolkien was a Beowulf scholar. His first job actually was to write the New English Dictionary. He helped to draft the OED. So if you open up the OED, and especially if you look at the W, I believe walrus may have been written by Tolkien, the original definition for walrus. And so Tolkien was very interested in the origins of words, English words in this case. And he was an expert in Beowulf, which had a lot of old English words, ancestral English words, right? And in fact, as a scholar, he's probably a little unappreciated, even so. But people have just begun to, have really started to appreciate some of his essays. Beowulf, the Monsters and the Critics is a great essay. On Fairy Stories is another essay he writes about fairy stories. But these are really excellent works of scholarship. He was also a translator. He translated Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and he translated the Book of Jonah for the Jerusalem Bible. So I bought a copy of that just so I could read Tolkien's version of Jonah. Now, of course, what he worked with was a tree of languages, just like what he built in the Middle-earth. Except that when he's studying Beowulf, of course, he's studying the real-life tree of languages. The idea is that they come from an Indo-European root. You have a Germanic branch, you have an Italic branch, an Iranian branch, a Celtic branch. You have all these different branches that go off. And you see, where's English? Should be somewhere on the Germanic. Yeah, there we are. There's Middle English, and there's Modern English coming off of Middle English. The idea is you can figure out these branches if you look at the relationship of the words, just like with the DNA letters. DNA letters were different, figure out relationship. Same thing with words, and it's what Tolkien did. And this is what I was interested in, because Tolkien, as a committed Christian his whole life, as one who creatively applied his faith and maintained it in a scholarly environment, what did he do with this knowledge? Oh, and by the way, we can now use computers to make trees, but they look like the old trees, pretty much. There's always something to fight about, right? But they look pretty much like the old trees you see here. Where's English on this? There's Welsh, there's Irish, there's the German, and there's English right there. There's the German branch. Similar to the other ones, maybe a bit more detail, but overall it looks like the same tree. You could draw it pretty similar to the other one. And here's an example of what Tolkien would do, or what a philologist would do, with like early English work. This is the Miller's Tale from Chaucer. I don't know if you had to read that in high school, but you can see the different manuscripts and see the way the different manuscripts use the words and try to figure out the relationship between the manuscripts. This is what Tolkien would do. He would draw a tree in his mind or on paper, and the philologist's goal is to find the rules by which changes happen. Why is there an is? Why is there a that is instead of a was there? You know, how does this all work? Why is eek here and it's there? You know, and they actually come up with mechanisms, rules for which kind of words change and how words branch out from each other, how manuscripts branch out, and how whole languages branch out. And so when I saw this, I was like, you know, Tolkien was a biochemist and he didn't know it. He'd probably be grumpy if I said that. He's grumpy about everything. But he made trees just like I make trees by looking at DNA words. So what did he do with those? And this is Chaucer. This is Chaucer, J.R. Tolkien talking about Chaucer. It's one of the things that he studied. Of all the jokes that Chaucer ever perpetuated, the one that most calls for philological annotation is the dialect talk in the Reeve's Tale. For the joke of this dialogue is and was primarily a linguistic joke, and is indeed now one only a philologist can laugh sincerely. So apparently Tolkien was able to find out what was funny in Chaucer to a philologist, and he had these sort of scholarly jokes with his scholarly pals or whatever. I don't get the joke either, but that's, the point is that Tolkien was a scholar of these words. So here's another picture of Tolkien's languages that lay behind Middle-earth. The languages are related to history in Tolkien's work. The elves have a fragmented language, and the elves themselves are fragmented people. Why are they all going to the west? Do you really get an idea of that from watching the movies? You just know that they're all like lighting candles and walking to the west. Well, it has to do with the fact that the elves were separated long ago from the west. Their very languages were separated. Tolkien wrote his history around that fact. So it's interesting how the language trees influence the history of Middle-earth. The languages show the same pattern of fragmentation. Oh, by the way, if you know the languages, you can pick up some hints in the Two Towers. I read this. Its name was Cirith Ungol, a name of dreadful rumor. Remember where Cirith Ungol is? It's at the top of the range of mountains above Minas Morgul, where Frodo and Sam are going to, and who's trying to convince them to go there? Smeagol, right? Gollum is trying to convince them to go there because he knows that there's something there. And what Tolkien says in the Two Towers is if the hobbits had only known their language, if they had been good enough philologists, they would have understood that they shouldn't really trust Smeagol to take them to a place called Cirith Ungol. Aragorn could perhaps have told them that name and its significance. Gandalf would have warned them. Gandalf definitely was a philologist. But they were alone, and so they didn't know that in the name, Ungol means spider. There was a like sort of spider creature called Ungoliant that destroyed the two trees that gave light to the west. There's those trees again, right? They're destroyed by Melkor, who's like the big baddie before Sauron, and his pal, Ungoliant, the big spider. And there's, of course, fan art showing this. This didn't show up in the movies yet, although to pad out The Hobbit, Peter Jackson might have to go back this far. But, sorry. I'm just skeptical that you can make 3 movies out of it. But this is way before all that, and Ungoliant, the evil spider, destroys the original trees that gave light to Middle-earth. The white tree is a descendant, an offshoot of one of these trees. So, since Tolkien was a lifelong Catholic, I saw him as I first saw him as an author, but he was a scholar too. So how did he do scholarship and faith? And one thing I noticed, he used the Tower of Babel story, he referred to it in correspondence, but he did not use it as a scientific explanation for why language is fragmented. He did not use it as an explanation for why Indo-European became Germanic. He definitely did not use it for why Germanic and English split off. Instead, he accepted the scholarly explanations for the mechanism by which these changes happened, by which these fragmentations happened. And I was very interested by this observation, and this is why I say that maybe Tolkien would be more interested in these DNA trees than Grumpy. So because I see DNA words that look like the language trees, the philology trees. Tolkien had room for a tree of languages and the Genesis tree of life. He very clearly dedicated his whole life, and you can talk about how his faith shines through in Lord of the Rings. I can tell you hundreds of things, but it's a long story. But there's lots of ways in which it goes through, and Tolkien was not an intellectual coward. He was like the most immune to peer pressure of anybody I've ever seen. So it's not like he was saying, okay, scholars, I don't want the scholars to get mad at me, so I'm going to go along with the Tree of Languages rather than the Tower of Babel story. He really integrated both his science and his faith. So when I look at the trees, and there's just a quick biochemical story. I'll skip over most of the details because some of you are in biochemistry and we aren't even really into the point of biochemistry where I can really talk about this. But I can just say that there are some scientists who are trying to find ancestral enzymes by looking at trees of existing enzymes and working their way back to try to figure out what the ancestral enzyme was. Sounds exactly what Tolkien would have done by trying to figure out what the ancestral word was when you have a word that's shared in many languages. So these ancestral nodes of the tree, you can work back, and they basically made these enzymes. They studied how they do this reaction biochemically. This is actually a disulfide reduction. We've even already talked about this in biochemistry a little bit. This is an enzyme that breaks disulfide bonds. And so they had a nice little assay to check how the enzyme does it. So they made these ancient enzymes, and they saw how they worked. And it's interesting. They saw three things. First of all, these enzymes, these guys over here, and these are the modern ones, the ancient enzymes work better at low pH. There's other lines of evidence saying that when the Earth was older, it was more acidic. It was at lower pH. All of these guys work better at low pH. They also work better with a weird substrate, modern, ancient. And these three work weird. This is a weird substrate that you give to it, and the enzyme will still work on it. So they're not as picky. So more resistant to acid, less picky as you get more ancient. And this is a real surprise, though. People have seen things like this before. People haven't looked at them in this much detail. They all do. There's two ways to do this chemistry. You can do it the simple way, like a one-step way, or you can do it a more complicated way, a three-step way. All these ancient ones, you would think that the ancient ones the older ones might do it with a one-step way. But actually all the ancient ones do it in the three-step way. There's the evidence right there for that, but you probably trust me. They all fit a three-step kinetic model. That's surprisingly sophisticated. It's a little bit like, one of those walking through an ancient like Neanderthal and having him speak like Sir Laurence Olivier, being able to use the same words or being able to interact the same way as being able to work the same way as the more recent, the more modern enzymes. They look sophisticated as far as their mechanism goes, their organic chemistry. And so this is a quote straight from the paper. It seems reasonable that they would have had a less structured groove, making their chemistry more similar to that of simple reducing agents. In other words, one-step mechanism. It seems reasonable they'd be simpler and would have a simpler kinetic mechanism. However, the three-step chemistry appears to have been established early, about 4 gigayears ago, 4 billion years ago, in the same manner as is observed today. We don't see them taking shortcuts. They're sophisticated mechanisms. This suggests that there was a big step early in molecular evolution. I find that interesting. There's a member of the Inklings who's controversial, and I kind of have a love-hate relationship with him. It's Owen Barfield, and last year I had students read something in Capstone. I may do that again this year. Don't take everything he says at face value. Don't take anything that I give you all at face value. But he was a friend of C.S. Lewis's, and he has this interesting idea that ancient words were concrete and undivided in meaning, and later became specialized and specific, like the trees, meaning fragmented over time. And he fits this in with the philology, like he loved words like Tolkien did, and he had to strain those of philologists like Tolkien. There's a Tolkien scholar, and yes, there is an area called Tolkien scholarship, who wrote a book called Splintered Light that I thought was a very interesting book because it shows how Tolkien took some of Barfield's ideas and put them into Middle-earth. The whole idea that language would influence history, that the whole idea of the fragmentation of meaning. She argues that some of these ideas percolated through Tolkien. Owen Barfield, by the way, if you look him up on Wikipedia, he had some other really bizarre ideas that make me really annoyed with him. I'm like, why can't you just be right? But I think that he has a mixture of right and wrong. And I think it's interesting to think about, maybe he's right in this way. Maybe he's right that language is like this. And if that's the case, DNA words might be a little bit like that as well. Here's an example that Barfield uses. You know what John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God? The word for word is logos. But that means several things at once. If you dig down into what John's saying, if you go to a Sunday school class on John 1, then you'll get all these, you'll find out that logos means wisdom, language word, guiding principle, creation event, all at once. It encapsulates all of these meanings. And I think that maybe that's a little bit like the ancient enzyme having the sophisticated three-step mechanism, the meaning for logos being a sophisticated, multivalent meaning. Did enzymes follow a pattern of fragmentation where the subsequent specialization? I don't know, but I'm intrigued at the idea that they could be like a language. There's some ways in which they're definitely not like a language, by the way. Nobody speaks enzyme, right? But it's just ideas. So the thing is, though, if I'm saying that there's Darwin's tree, that there's some truth in Darwin's tree, that we actually might find some interesting things if we look back at the ancient roots of Darwin's tree. There's a big objection. Isn't it built on the assumption, on atheism? Isn't it built on there being randomness and evil? And I don't have a complete answer to this, but I do open my Bible to about the middle, and I see a whole book that is set more ancient than any other book of the Bible completely. Job. And Job deals with this question, the question of randomness and natural evil. And then God comes around at the end, and God basically says, he answers without giving an answer. But he answers in a really interesting way. He talks about Leviathan, his creation. You can hear a hint of pride in his voice as he talks about how terrible Leviathan is. I mean, what's going on here? There's a lot to understand in this ancient language that I'm just not sure that I think there's a lot to dig into with this. What is going on in Job? Can you catch him with a fish hook or hold his tongue down with a rope? Will you make a pet of him like a bird? Keep him on a lead to amuse your little girls? He's God saying, no, you won't. Any hope you might have would be futile. The mere sight of him would overwhelm you. He has no equal on earth, being created without fear. And this is what God gives to answer Job's questions. How is this an answer? Well, it's interesting because it's not an answer and it is an answer. Leviathan is a creature, too. Leviathan was created. Leviathan is not tamed, but another writer of this wrote, Aslan is not a tamed lion, right? There's a wildness to creation, and yet here, God is delighting in it. In one of the most terrible, fearsome creatures made. Another movie to address these questions is Terrence Malick's Tree of Life. It opens with a quote from Job 38. It's the very first thing you see. I need to see that movie again. And so I like the image of the Tree of Life. And I think that the Darwinian Tree of Science can coexist in a way with the Tree of Life that we read about in Genesis 3. I have a friend from college who got this tattoo, and it's a tree, and he got it of the Tree of Life, and his reference was Ezekiel 47. fruit trees of all kinds will grow on both banks of the river. This is a vision of the new temple that Ezekiel is saying will hold the glory of God after the first temple was destroyed. Their leaves will not wither nor their fruit fail. Every month they will bear fruit, because water from the sanctuary flows to them. Their fruit will serve for food and their leaves for healing. The point of the tree of life is the healing of the nations. So, and then there's one more thing. Of course, Revelation 22 builds on this. The angel showed me the river of life flowing from the throne of God and the Lamb and flowing crystal clear. Very similar building upon Ezekiel's language. Down the middle of the city street, on either bank of the river, were the trees of life. If you read some translations, it will say the tree of life. But then it will say the river flows through the tree of life. And so I have this picture of, like, you know, this big tree house type tree, and the river's like flowing under it, and there's this little tunnel, like General Sherman tree, you can drive through it or something like that. That's not the image that it's doing here. It's having an image of a grove of trees. So I think it's really illuminating to see that in this vision of the New Jerusalem, there is not one tree of life. There is a grove of trees of life. And the purpose of those trees is to bear fruit, to cure the nations. They all are watered by one source. Not every tree is a tree of life. But you have a whole grove of them. And I think there's something in this image that gives me hope. It doesn't work things out entirely for me, but it gives me hope that the trees of life that two trees of life can coexist in one place. So these are the trees that the cholera tree, cure for the nations, the philology tree, fragmented words, and the urzyme tree, as a biochemist I went to see, are these original enzymes more sophisticated than we expect. And thank you for listening. Do you want the questions next week?
Yeah, next week, your summary of today and your summary of the reading that was discussed next week. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone. If you ever want to talk about Tolkien, here I am.